Hello, today I'd like to talk with you about some of the fascinating aspects of the development of the mind of a preschool child. Specifically, we're going to be discussing notions of egocentrism, which is, of course, one of Piaget's ideas, and another of Piaget's ideas having to do with conservation, and then another idea uh, explored by other researchers having to do with theory of mind. As you're probably aware, in Piaget's second stage of cognitive development, his pre-operational stage, he explores the kind of changes that are going on in the cognitive development of a child between the ages of about 2 and 7. You might recall from our earlier discussion of Piaget that he developed his theory based on his observations of his own children. It's very fascinating to read his writings about his own children and how they helped him come up with some of his ideas. He is interested in better understanding qualitative changes in the child's thinking more than quantitative changes. In other words, how does a child think about things rather than how much they know about things? And in the pre-operational stage of development, one of the areas that he writes about is egocentrism. When you look at that word, ego meaning the self, and centrism, centering around, it gives us an idea about what he's talking about. We all know adults who are egocentric, that is, they tend to put themselves first ahead of other people in not so healthy ways. And it's hard for them to look at things maybe from the perspective of others, harder for them to do that. But in a young child, egocentrism has a slightly different meaning, in that what he's getting at here is that the child lacks the capacity to understand things from the perspective of other people. And the child believes that everyone looks at the world like the child looks at the world. That's what he's getting at with egocentrism in a preschool child in the pre-operational stage of development. A great example of this for me has to do with a little boy who was out in his yard exploring. He's 4 years old, and he catches a frog. He catches the frog and he puts the frog in a shoebox, and he punches some holes in the shoebox, puts some grass in there. He's so excited because he had never caught a frog before. And he also realizes that on this day that he catches the frog, it is his mother's birthday. So he runs into the house with the frog and says, "Happy birthday, Mommy. Here's your present," and gives his mother the frog. He expects his mother to be just as excited about getting that frog as he is. That's the kind of egocentrism that Piaget is describing. If we're raising children or working with children as teachers, understanding egocentrism during the preschool years can be a helpful aspect of development to appreciate, because while children sometimes they may not share very well or do or say things that are hurtful to other kids. Of course, older kids and adults are capable of that as well. But in young children, they just may not understand that just because they want that toy, that some other child might not want that toy too, because they think that everybody sees the world more from their perspective, and they lack the ability to understand the perspective of other people. Of course, that gradually emerges, but it's something that Piaget observed in the pre-operational stage of development. In other words, it's hard for the child to engage in perspective taking and look at the world from the perspective of another person. As it turns out, our ability to develop perspective taking as we grow up is extremely important, because it allows us eventually to be able to have empathy to a greater extent for other people, and also to engage in more mature moral reasoning that we'll be exploring later on. Another interesting observation that Piaget made was that children lack what he calls conservation. And in general, the young child's inability to understand conservation is a good example of how young children lack logical thinking ability to the extent that older children are able to think logically. So conservation has to do with our ability to understand that the basic properties of something don't change just because, say, the size of the container that an object is contained in changes. That the amount of something, in other words, can remain the same even though the size of the container holding it changes. His classic experiment where he demonstrated lack of conservation in young children was with the water in glasses. He would pour water into 2 short fat glasses, and then he would pour one of those short fat glasses into a tall skinny glass while the child was watching. And he would ask the child, does the tall skinny glass now have the same amount, more or less water than the short fat glass? And children who have not yet mastered conservation would say that the tall skinny glass has more water because it is higher. I provided you with a video of actual children approaching the conservation task, so you can see for yourself the differences in the thinking processes of younger and older children as it relates to this task. So Piaget was fascinated by this observation, and he wondered why it is that younger children lack the ability to understand conservation. And he came up with some pretty interesting ideas about this. For example, he said that young children lack what he called transformational thought. They can't really yet understand in their mind that something can be transformed from one state to another state. They also lack reversibility of thought, where they can't play it back in their mind and then play it forward again, like you might a video. And he said that young children engage in what he called centration, C-E-N-T-R-A-T-I-O-N, meaning that they can only center on or focus on one aspect of a situation at a time. And in the conservation experiment involving water, they were only able to focus on the height of the liquid. They could not focus on the height of the liquid and the size of the container at the same time. Older children, however, get this right quite easily. And you might even try this little experiment at home with your kids and see how they do with it. I did it with my granddaughters once when they were younger. One was in the pre-operational stage and the other in the concrete operational stage, the third stage. When I was visiting them, we did this at the breakfast table one morning. And my daughter, who knows how I am, she just kind of rolled her eyes, but the kids really enjoyed doing the task. And the younger one didn't understand that it was the same amount of water, but the older one did. It was pretty cool. Another notion that I'd like to talk with you about that emerges during the pre-operational period of development, during the preschool years, is what's called theory of mind. I don't know that this was so much Piaget's idea as the idea of other people, but it's occurring during the same time period. Theory of mind has to do with our ability to understand that other people have thoughts and intentions separate from our own. And it's not until around the age of 3 or 4 that children begin to understand theory of mind. This has been demonstrated quite brilliantly with a kind of experimental method called the false belief test or task, where children are put in a situation where they have to, in order to get it right, be able to look at something from the perspective of another person whose perspective would be different than their own. And they're not able to do it until around the age of 3 or 4. So developing theory of mind also helps us to be able to engage in the kind of perspective taking that's important later in life as we develop greater empathy for others, the ability to communicate more effectively, and to engage in mature moral reasoning. So these are some of the fascinating changes that are occurring in the mind of a young child that I wanted to comment on today. And I look forward to your opportunity to dig more deeply into these ideas in your reading. Thank you. I look forward to talking with you again soon.